Good evening, my washers and dryers, and welcome back to The Large Amount, where today we are talking about everything I read in the month of June. First book I read in the month of June was Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This is a darling if you're circling any kind of book community. You've probably seen this book and you've heard people rave about it, while also being incredibly vague about what happens. And I finally sat down because I'm like, yeah, sure, fine, what's happening? Tell me about it. And I sat down and read it, and I had a really good time. The big thing that I want to emphasize for this one is it manages to be whimsical while being grounded, and that is probably the like one statement review I would give for it. Basically, you have a guy named Piranesi who lives in this big labyrinth-like house, and the book is told through his journal perspectives. The only other person he has contact with is someone called the Other, who is either very charming to Piranesi, very nice to him, or very hostile and very cold. And the whole time I'm reading this, I'm like, is this a metaphor for like the Garden of Eden? Is Piranesi man? Is the Other God? And by the time I got to the end of the book, I was like, I'm not sure if that description still doesn't apply. You know, it has very much that atmosphere, especially when Susanna Clarke does the interesting thing of capitalizing random words, which may just be, in the process of transposing Piranesi's handwriting to text. You just have random letters that are capitalized. And so I was like trying to be big brain about it the whole time I'm reading and like trying to see if there's a pattern for what was capitalized and what wasn't. And there's not really a pattern. I've actually written something very similar like 10 years ago. And so it manages to feel nostalgic, at least for me. But I think if you're really into the Chronicles of Narnia, this is the grown-up Narnia without being the Magicians. If you've tried The Magicians by Lev Grossman and you're not really into it, this is a different take, kind of, I think, on the Narnia concept that I think is really well executed, and it's a really neat concept. It takes a second to get into, but yeah, if you're looking for Granddad's Isekai, this is what it is. About the same time, I also was reading Piranesi. I started Doomsday book by Connie Willis because this is a thick boy, and I knew it was going to take me a second to get through all of it, and I'm really glad I did. I was expecting pulpy sci-fi, and I definitely got pulpy sci-fi. There's a narrative nonfiction book called The Hot Zone, which is about an Ebola outbreak. And this book, in some ways, asks the question, what's worse than an Ebola outbreak? An Ebola outbreak plus time travel. And in some ways, it asks and goes even further because it's not an Ebola outbreak. It's like the plague all over again. Basically, in the near future, I believe it's set in the 2050s, there is a history department that does a lot of time travel for their studies. And they are sending a girl named Kivrin back to the 14th century. She is told repeatedly, you are 40 years before the plague, or even 50 years before the plague. You have nothing to worry about. And they do all their precautions. They get ready to send her forward. And about the time they're ready to send her forward, the technician who's supposed to help her collapses and is seriously ill. They rush him to the hospital, and he's delirious the whole time, saying, hey, there's been a slip. It should be fine. I tried to fix it, but there's a slip. Don't worry about it. And they're not sure what that means. But meanwhile, we're with Kivrin in the Middle Ages, and that's super cool because what Connie Willis does is they take into account that, sure, they spoke English, but that's a very loose definition of English, and no one transported back to the 1300s would understand what anyone is saying. And so we have lots of passages where she's trying to translate in her head, and you as a reader are trying to translate what other people are saying because it's all in Middle English. One of the things that really stuck out to me about this book is the dedication to killing characters, and characters would die off screen. And major characters, in fact, and you just be like, yeah, they died. This ended up being a funny book. Not funny haha, but funny ironic, because they're dealing with this outbreak in modern London and talking about the quarantine that happened 20 years ago in the US. And I'm like, oh, ahaha, ahaha, ahaha. Ahaha. It's a weird one. I don't know that you will necessarily see people outside of sci-fi circles talking about it, and unfortunately I think sci-fi is kind of a difficult genre to get into for a lot of readers if they aren't already affiliated with that genre, they already like it. But I was glad I put in the time to read this because this was good. It was dense. It's got that classic mass market paperback tiny print. But yeah, if you like contagion stories or time travel stories. If you like the Time Wars series, this is an obscure pick, but it's one of my favorite series. I think you'd be really into this as well. It's a Hugo and Nebula award winner, and I can clearly see why. It was a really cool book. I had a good time with it. This one we gotta talk about. So after reading Doomsday book, I picked up Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. And I got beef with Ariadne. We gotta talk about this, okay? Myth retelling is not a new concept. It is not really even an old concept, because in some ways it's an ancient concept. We've been rewriting mythology for forever. I am not a mythology scholar. I am not a literary scholar. I am a reader trying to basically market new things to people by doing this, by talking about my experience with a book. If you're unfamiliar with Ariadne, or it's been a hot minute since you've busted out your your mythology collection, Ariadne is the daughter of King Minos of Crete. She is the half-sister of the Minotaur. She runs away with Theseus, who ditches her on an island, and she ends up marrying Dionysus, the god of wine. This book, at least as it was described to me by other people who have read and loved this book, was it is a feminist retelling of the book. And unfortunately, when someone says feminist retelling, that raises this artificial bar of, okay, impress me. And it adds these artificial standards where we automatically assume it's not going to be good. And that is an unfortunate consequence and maybe was not fair. Another thing that works against this book is it is a retelling of myth. The things that happen in the myth, Jennifer Saint sticks very closely to what happened. We do not deviate from things at all. And there's a suspension of disbelief involved in mythology wherein you can have a one-line sentence of what someone does, and we don't get the expansion upon their thoughts, their goings-on, to the point where if we have something that someone does that to us doesn't make sense, we're willing to give it the benefit of the doubt in mythology, because by the time we've read that sentence, we're already halfway through a whole other paragraph that's talking about something completely different. And so with Ariadne, we're dwelling on the thought processes of the characters, and that doesn't necessarily work in the narrative's favor. So what do we mean when we say feminist retelling? Quite frankly, I don't know. I don't know what that means, because the takeaway I get from this book is that feminist retelling means all of the actions done by male figures that we have typically seen as heroic or noble are just seen as really crappy, and the women are just sad all the time because they have no agency, or they're scared because their husbands are, demigods, which, fair. There are certain scenes where character decisions, and these are decisions made in the throes of fear and terror, come across as silly, and they really shouldn't. And this is just my experience. I had a negative experience with this book. That does not mean that everyone else will have a negative experience with this book. Okay, thing that stuck with me the most is there's a passage very early in the book wherein Ariadne is told the story of Medusa, who, of course, was decapitated, I believe by Perseus. Medusa, who was punished by the gods for the actions of Poseidon. The story of Medusa is contrasted with the story of Pasiphae, who is Ariadne's mother. And Pasiphae was also punished for the gods' actions by having to give birth to the Minotaur. And Ariadne tells the readers, she's like, no matter what happens, I am going to be a Medusa. I am going to fight back against the punishment of the gods. I will not take anything lying down, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, all right, that's the thesis. That's the theme that we're going to see through. The ending of the book, it doesn't feel like that gets fulfilled. For all of the talk of I'm not going to let men control me. I'm not going to let men hold me back. I'm not going to let the consequences of men affect me. The whole book is just the consequences of men affecting Ariadne. Is that what makes it a feminist retelling? And I'm genuinely asking these questions because I genuinely want to know how other people interpret this work, because for me, it did not live up to the product I was expecting. One thing that I do enjoy, though, is the story that Theseus tells about Heracles. So Heracles comes to stay with Theseus and his dad in Athens, and Heracles during the day, he's like, yeah, no, I'm a super cool guy. I did all of these great acts of heroism and all these feats of grandeur. And then after dark, Heracles gets drunk and he's like, yeah, and then I tore my wife and children apart. And that dichotomy I really enjoy. And I understand that that's not the point of this book, but the idea that Theseus is like, I have heard the risks of heroism and I am willing to go through with it anyway. Again, not the point of the book, and maybe that's internalized misogyny, whatever. I think there is a good story through here. It's very well written, very beautifully written, very well crafted. Jennifer Saint has kind of this blend of modern text with ancient text, so it reads like myth. If I were to expand upon a myth, it reads like that. I also really, really enjoyed the treatment of Dionysus, of the way that he is very nice, very sweet when he's doing just like the bare minimum being a cool guy, because in my own depravity, were I unwed, Dionysus ranks like in the upper 3 of gods I'd be cool marrying. You know, Hades tops the list, but Hades is taken and we all respect that. But like Dionysus is probably 2 or 3. Hephaestus would be the other one. You know, in the situation where that has to be like an answered question. Bringing it all back, Ariadne ended up being a very disappointing read because I think the mythology aspect works against the story. Maybe I just don't understand what a feminist retelling is. Maybe I just missed the point, but it seems like everything that happened to Ariadne, she took lying down. The closest we get to agency is her helping Theseus at the beginning of the book. That's barely in the first third of the book. She helps him escape the labyrinth, and then he ditches her on an island, and she marries Dionysus and has his kids, which, like, that's a perfectly fulfilling life to settle down with someone and start a family. But then it's just, you know, his ego gets in the way. The ego of other men gets in the way. Her sister and that whole messed up thing gets in the way. It also feels like cheating to call the book Ariadne when a third of this book is from Phaedra's perspective. And it's, I get it, you need that name recognition, you need the branding, but it's, I don't know what a better title for this would be. Maybe Women of Crete, where, you know, we're also dealing with Pasiphae. Maybe that would be a better through line, is to start with Pasiphae, where, you know, Ariadne is trying to break a legacy of consequences rather than, you know, the very shallow defiance that we get. I don't know. Other people had a lovely, wonderful experience with it. This was a 5 out of 5 for a lot of people. For me, it was like a 2 out of 5. And I was very disillusioned by the time I got to the end of it. After that, I read Book of Night by Holly Black. This was her adult debut that everyone was buzzing about, and I was very excited too. I remember reading the Spiderwick Chronicles by Holly Black decades ago and really enjoying it, and so I was so excited to jump into this because the concept was interesting. So in this world we have shadow magic, where a lot of magic is derived from the shadow. You can kind of make your shadow more manifest and do things for you, or you can steal shadow, you can separate your shadow from you. You can do a lot of cool things with it. And we follow our protagonist, Charlie Hall, who is kind of a mess up, kind of a screw up, and she gets tangled into this heist revolving around the Book of Night, and we kind of follow her as she gets tangled deeper and deeper into this scenario. And it's really well written. I had a really fun time with it. I really like the voice that she gives to Charlie, even though the book is in third person. It's also one of the first times I have ever seen the size 14 explicitly stated, and as someone who is a size 14, I was like, oh, hey, okay, cool. So when they say she's fat, she's genuinely fat. All right, we haven't seen that before. Another thing that I also really appreciated about this is that Charlie and her boyfriend Vince, their dynamic never fell into tropes that I had seen dozens of times. I was really nervous that they were going to take their relationship in an unsatisfying direction, or they were going to cave to tropes that are just lazy, in my opinion. Again, tropes aren't bad, but there are some that I'm just like, oh, okay. She gets involved and they break up and blah, blah, blah. They didn't do that. I was really impressed with how that went, and I like Vince as a character. I'm a big fan of his line of work. I think that was a really fun decision for Holly to make Vince be like a cleaner of the unsavory of being the guy they call in when it's like, oh man, this guy exploded all over the walls, could he clean it up? I like that. I think that's a good choice, and it kind of adds to some of the red flags that Charlie notices but doesn't want to pay attention to because every guy she has dated has just been like made of red flags. I don't know if I'm interested in a sequel necessarily. I think what I read satisfied me enough. But I had a good time with it. I like the kind of grungy urban fantasy where everything is very integrated, where you have BuzzFeed articles about the kind of magic that happens in the universe. I think that was a really cool decision. So if you like urban fantasy, definitely check it out. It's really good. And last, for the month of June, I read The Atlas 6 by Olivie Black, which is another BookTube book talk darling that everyone talks about. And I had the original Amazon self-published version because I wanted to compare it to this one and kind of look at how editors handled the source material. I do think this one is definitely better from what I read. It seems like it's tighter, a little bit cleaner, but it's still good. I often think about how I am amiably jealous of Olivie Black because she's out there living my dream. Your self-published book becomes a fully published book and you give birth to your first child. Like, that's What else can you ask for? So the Atlas Six tells the story of the Alexandria Society, wherein all of the magic and knowledge of the world is kept in a singular location. What was the Library of Alexandria, kind of like Sherlock, Reichenbach Falls itself, periodically to keep all of its knowledge protected. And so every 10 years, they select 6 magic users, one of whom is sent home, and from those 5, one can become caretaker of all of this secret knowledge. And so we follow the characters of Libby, Nico, Parisa, Reyna, Callum, and Tristan, all of whom are competing to be caretakers. The approach that they take for the magic is a very kind of grounded philosophical scientific approach where you're doing more experiments with your magic. There are lots of different kinds of magic, from like empathy-based magic to physical-based magic to plant-based magic and stuff like that, and I do enjoy that. I am also a sucker for secret societies that are just a little corrupt, where it's like you can never fully tell if you can trust who you're working with. There's a lot of cool things that are happening in the book. I also think it is tailor-made for its audience. It's very convenient that the 6 best people for the job are all conveniently hot and within 5 years of each other. You expect me to believe that? You think my suspension of disbelief goes that far? It is convenient. I get it. I probably would have done the same thing. I understand putting 6 hot people together in a school and being like, all right, do your magic. Some of the characters feel a little interchangeable. I always had a hard time discerning between Callum and Tristan, and saying that out loud, it's like, that feels weird because I could tell you distinct personality traits about each of them, and I don't know how you would necessarily fix like having more time with those characters. But there's definitely a vagueness to some of the characters where they don't have a strong connection. Nico and Libby have a very tight connection because they knew each other going in, and so their scenes feel very strong because they know each other already. Whereas the scenes with some of the newer characters who don't have a pre-existing relationship, it's a little bit harder to discern all of their personality traits. Some of them are more straightforward than others. Parisa is very easy to read. But yeah, Callum and Tristan, and the illustrations sometimes don't help, which is a shame. The illustrations are really cool, but I would have liked a label for the guys. Just a little clarification, because I think Nico and maybe Ezra, I don't know if Ezra is a drawing, and Tristan, their skin tones are all kind of ambiguously brown in the pictures, and they're in black and white, so it's a little difficult for me to discern which is which. It's a cool book. I'm not saying I disliked it. And I pre-ordered the sequel because I think there are cool things happening, and I am honestly more excited for what the sequel will do than this one. I think secret societies are great, secret schools are even better, and clandestine organizations, give that to me every day, and I will eat it up in every iteration. But there is something very exciting of, ooh, we're leaving, and I'm excited for that. I think that will be good for the series, assuming that's where it's gonna go. Also, this is me being petty. This has nothing to do with the quality of writing, but Parisa at one point says being beautiful is not everything. Parisa, she is kind of a mind reader of sorts. She doesn't call herself an escort, but that's kind of what she does. She sleeps with powerful people to learn their magic, to learn their secrets, and she dips. Fine pursuit. She is painfully beautiful and not vain about it, but she understands the power that she has. But she gives the classic, being pretty isn't everything. When that is given by an attractive person, I understand what they're saying. They're saying, I thought being pretty would give me everything I want, and it hasn't. Hearing that, as someone who, on an average day, feels like a 4, on her best days, 6.5, I don't need to hear the 9 saying this, I don't need to hear the 9 saying, being a 9 isn't everything, you poor little 6.5s. I'm like, I know, it comes across as a woe is me. And her backstory is sad. There's some messed up stuff in her backstory, but it's really hard for me to be sympathetic for her character. And again, this is not to say the character is poorly written or that the character is bad. This is just me being petty. And that is what I read in the month of June. I almost didn't finish my books on time because I got another editing project that was really big. But also I started watching The Sopranos, and this is the coldest take of the 21st century, but Sopranos good. I also started watching Vinland Saga, blasted through Vinland Saga. That stuff is good. That is some good Viking content, and I am not crazy about like old medieval settings. I've got a thing I want to do for Vinland Saga, and it's just taking me forever to write because I'm reading. Here's what I'm going to read in the month of July. Serpent and Dove by Shelby Mahurin. I've already finished this. I'm filming this on July 3rd, and I've already read it, so more on that later. Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. Scattered All Over the Earth by Yoko Tawada. Born Standing Up by Steve Martin. Cruel Prince by Holly Black, and Circe by Madeline Miller. And that's it. That's what I read. That's what I will be reading. And that's it for this video. Let me know what you're reading, if you're reading. Let me know what you're watching. If you're watching cool things, I hope you're having a lovely, lovely evening, and I will see you all next time.